Go ahead and take your Bibles this morning, if you will, and open them up to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And we are going to be in chapter 32 today. Genesis chapter 32. And we are going to look at a story that you have heard before, but it is one that we just never forget. We just cannot overlook, and we cannot just move on past this story in Genesis chapter 32, which involves Jacob. I want to say, first of all, is that as we are looking at this series, this is personal. This story was one that really I could not get out of my mind, as far as one that really illustrates how personal of a God that we serve, a God that personally loves us, who is personally involved in our lives, who cares for us, and engages with us relationally. And that's exactly what happens here in this story in Genesis chapter 32. Another idea that I wanted to share with you is that sometimes I'm afraid that we don't take the blessing of God as seriously as we should. We are maybe a little too nonchalant about it. We get the idea of when we hear the gospel message that, I'll buy into that. If it benefits me, then sign me up. I want to sign up for it. If it will get me out of hell, then sign me up. I'm in. And I'm going to tell you the problem with that is there's too many ifs in that. If it will get me out of hell. If it will benefit me. I'm telling you that this is real. And there was a time in Jacob's life that we're going to look at where this became real to him. Genesis chapter 32, and I'm going to rehearse some of the events in this because it's been a while since we've probably gone back and looked at Jacob's life. We may have forgotten some things. But this is a time of transition in his life. You know, sometimes transitions can be difficult, can't they? We move from one phase of life to another, and sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're not. And there's a transition that's described here in Genesis chapter 32, and it's a very difficult transition. But as people say nowadays, God showed up and God showed out. Maybe to put it in plainer terms, maybe even more in reverent terms than that, maybe more respectful terms to God, as if He's some kind of entertainer that just shows up and shows out, is that there was a humble request, a desperate request that was made to God, and God answered it. It's really that simple. We have a God who listens. We have a God who knows. We also have a gracious God who answers. In Genesis, going back to about chapter 25, 26, and 27, we start to learn about Isaac, and we know that he had two sons. He had twin boys. One was named Esau and one was named Jacob. And from the moment, even as they're coming out of the womb, it is said that Jacob grasped the heel of Esau, his brother. From the time of his inception into this world, he was known as a deceiver. He was known as one who would trip up other people. And I'm going to tell you what Jacob's problem was. He had the same problem that you and I do, is that many times he, like us, will rely on our own strength. We think that we can do this on our own. There's that terrible philosophy of nowadays. It is, and you've heard it, and maybe you've said it, and I've said it too, is I got this. You ever said that? You ever heard somebody else say that? I got this. I've got news for you. When it comes to the blessing of God, you ain't got this. God's got this. Because the blessing of God is the work of God. It's not going to be on your own strength. It's not going to be that you come to Him and you say, sign me up for that. I'm in. I'm all in if it means to save my hide out of the burning fires of hell. I'm in. Well, I got news for you. There's more to it than that, because salvation is a work of God, and the blessing is a work of God, and that's what Jacob would see. Notice there in Genesis chapter 32 and before, at the beginning of the chapter, before we get to verse 22, a little rough outline for you. In verses 1 through 5, Jacob is on a spiritual high. Notice there in verse 1 of chapter 32, what is being said there. It says that Jacob went on his way, and he's transitioning back to Canaan. He is going back to the land that God promised his father Abraham and his father Isaac. Jacob has been laboring, working for a wife, and he gets 2 wives, daughters of Laban, and he has been over there with Laban for 20 years. Now Jacob is told to return back to the land. He is going back to the promised land. And at the beginning of verse 32, it says Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he says, this is God's camp. Jacob, in the back of his mind, has a fear of his brother Esau. He has cheated Esau out of the birthright. He has deceived his father. He has deceived Esau. And as he comes back to the land, he knows that he is going to have to deal with Esau. He is on a spiritual high in the first few verses, but notice what happens there in verse 6. He begins to realize fear sets in. And he says there, or he is receiving word that Esau is coming to meet you, and he's bringing 400 men. Well, 400 men, that sounds like a little army, and fear begins to set in. And it says there in the text that he becomes greatly distressed about this. Well, Jacob does the right thing. In verses 9 through 12, he goes to God. And this is where we see this leaping off from verses 9 and 12. We leap off into verse 22, and we see the answer to the prayer in our message today. But read the prayer with me, follow along. Listen to what Jacob said. This is the request that I was talking about a while ago. We have a God who knows, and we have a God who listens, and then we have a God who graciously answers. Notice in 9 through 12 what Jacob said. He said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family. God, you told me to do this. You have told my father and my grandfather that this is my land, and now you've told me to come back. You have told me, God, you have told me. Let me tell you something. Let me stop right here, is that Jacob's life was characterized by that of deception, and he would use it by his own power, by hook or crook. He would always try to do things on his own. He had conflict with his father Isaac concerning the birthright. He had conflict with Esau, his brother, concerning the birthright. Then he goes and he moves off to start his life, and he has conflict with his father-in-law Laban. Everywhere that Jacob goes, he is involved in conflict. And now even when God says to go back to the country where I have given you this land, he is once again faced with conflict. You face conflict in your life. I face conflict in my life. But I'm going to go ahead and cut to the chase and tell you the point of all of this is all of this conflict in your life, we have to depend on the Lord. Here Jacob comes to God, and he's doing the right thing, and he reminds God of something he didn't need to be reminded of. But he says, I am not worthy, in verse 10, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray. Deliver me, I pray. I'm coming to you, God, and I'm asking for rescue. I'm asking for some way out of this. Now I realize I have met my match, and now I know that I need you, and I am asking you, Lord, come through now. And he says, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me, and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. The first thing I want you to see is a night alone. Look at verse 22 and what happens next. That was the prayer. That was the situation. Jacob is faced with meeting his brother Esau. There's going to be a standoff. There's going to be a showdown. There's going to be a great battle. And Jacob is fearing. Even though that God said to do this, Jacob is afraid. He is afraid. And I'm going to tell you what he's afraid of. He's afraid of what you and I are afraid of too. Is that when we come to a point in our life when we know that we are supposed to do something, when we know that God has said to do something, and then we realize that we cannot do it, we begin to fear. But listen to me very carefully. I said it a while ago and I'm going to say it again. We serve a God who knows. We serve a God who listens. And despite your inabilities, despite your weaknesses, God hears your prayer and He graciously answers. And He knows you are unworthy. He knows you have a little strength. He knows you can't do it. God can. Now watch what happens here in verse 22 through 24. It's a night alone. Oh, it's night, isn't it? I can't help but think the whole setting of it being night reminds us of the dark time of uncertainty that Jacob is experiencing. Do you follow me this morning? When you're going through a time of uncertainty, it feels dark, doesn't it? It feels, it just feels like something is off, something is not right. It's uncertain. And here in verse 22 it says, and he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed over the ford of Jabbok. That's a little river. It's a tributary of the Jordan River. And it says he took them and he sent them over the brook, and he sent over what he had. This is his life. He has sent his life, everything that he has worked for up to this point. This is his life. This is his family. And he is concerned about the safety of his family, and he sent them over there. And look at verse 24, and it says that Jacob was left alone. I'm going to tell you, maybe Jacob knew that he was alone, and Jacob knew that it was night. But God also knew that Jacob was alone. And God also knew that it was night. And God has something for him this night. Look at the end of the verse. It says, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. We're not told anything more about this, are we? There is someone who would wrestle with him. And may I say this, is that there's going to be a time in your life where you're going to come and it's going to be night. It's going to be a dark time in your life. And you're going to feel all alone. And you're going to look to your left and no one's going to be there. And you're going to look to your right and no one's going to be there. But I'm going to tell you who is there, is that God is there. And a man wrestled with him that night. The second thing I want you to see today is a new name. Look in verse 25. There's something very momentous that's going to happen to Jacob in verse 25. Now, when he saw that he did not prevail against him, and that is the man who is wrestling with him. And you've got to know this. You've got to understand this, or this story doesn't really make sense. as I said a while ago, is that Jacob would do anything in his power to get what he needed in life. And he would do it all on his own power. And I'm going to tell you, Jacob was good at it. He was a successful, by the eyes of the world, he was successful at what he did. If you go back and look at the beginning of, or the rest of chapter 32 in those verses, it talks about all the flocks of this and flocks of that he had. He had accumulated great wealth. He was a successful person in the eyes of the world, and he was good at deceiving people. Jacob was tenacious. Jacob was a fighter. A good word for it would be he was scrappy. He was good at maneuvering with people, and he was strong. And the one he was wrestling with that night realized Jacob's strength. And look what happens next. It says, now when he saw, and that was the man, that he did not prevail against him, the one who was wrestling with him has to resort to another measure. The one who was wrestling, in other words, the one who was wrestling with Jacob said, this Jacob ain't giving up. He's fighting me. He is wrestling with me. He is tenacious. He just won't quit. And the one who was wrestling with Jacob was someone much stronger than Jacob. And he touched the socket of his hip. You see that there? It says, when he realized that he could not prevail, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. I want you to know that this was no ordinary man. This was God Himself. And God had wrestled with Jacob and was able to touch his hip. Just, okay, Jacob, you're not going to give up. You're still going to lose. I'm going to probably say this again. I'm going to go ahead and say it now. As that you will never win until you lose. And God said, you're going to lose tonight. It could be that you're struggling with a decision of salvation. You're wrestling with God regarding salvation. It could be that you're saved and you're wrestling with submitting to His will. But I'm going to tell you this, when God sees to it, you will lose. And you will never receive the blessing until you lose first. Well, God defeated this Jacob this night. And look what happens next. He said, the man said, let me go. Let me go, because we've been doing this all night. You know, this night to me, it seems like just a one little picture of the life of Jacob. And there's many of you and there's many people out in this world who have been fighting God all of their life. They've been wrestling with God, whether it be for salvation or whether it be for service, whatever it is. You've been fighting God. You've been relying on your own strength. And God says, you're not going to win. You're not going to win this fight. And He touched Jacob and He disabled Jacob and He made him to where he could not fight anymore. And the man says, let go of me, Jacob. Let go of me. Well, I'm going to tell you learn something else about Jacob here. You see that his tenacity to do things on his own will, there's a transformation that takes place. Now listen to me very carefully and look at the text. Look at what happens here. But he said, this is what Jacob said in response to let me go. He says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The text doesn't give you every little detail and every little thought of Jacob, but what it does say is this is a turning point. This is when Jacob realizes that he is in the fight for his life. Hey, he ain't fighting Isaac anymore, okay? He ain't fighting an ordinary man. He's not fighting his brother Esau anymore. He's not fighting Laban anymore. And he's not fighting anyone else he's ever fought before. He's fighting God. And now he realizes that the one he is fighting with has the authority and the power to touch his hip and to bring him down and to take his strength away. And he also realizes is if he can do that, then he is my God. And he says, I'm not going to let you go. I'm going to tell you what happens here is the tenacity that Jacob once fought against God. He is using that tenacity to say, God, I will not let you go. I have a desire for your blessing. And I'm not going to let you go. Oh, I've struggled. I struggle with articulating to you what this means for you in your life. But I'm going to tell you this, is just like Jacob, your desire should be, Lord, I will not let you go. Now watch what happens because he's not done. Look at verse 27. So he said to him, this is what the man said, and I'm going to tell you the man knows. He says, what is your name? But there's a meaning in Jacob's name. Do you know it? Yeah, that's exactly right. Deceiver. He said, Jacob. He could have well said, I am deceiver. I'm going to tell you what that is. That's a confession, isn't it? I am deceiver. My name is Jacob. You know, the deceiver, the trickster, the cunning one, the one who relies on his own strength and will get what he needs to get by hook or crook. I am deceiver. But look what happens next. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob. Your name shall no longer be called deceiver, but Israel. He's given a new name. Oh, this is big. This is big. This is what the nation would be named after him. Jacob and his sons, the 12 tribes, the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. But there's a meaning in Israel's name, and it's God fights. That's what Israel means. It means God fights. Israel will have to learn, just like Jacob learned, that they are to depend on the Lord and let the Lord fight for them. They will have to learn that we're not going to win anything and I'm not going to get anything on my own strength. I'm going to have to rely on God because God fights. Oh, there's just a number of applications that could be made here in your life and in my life and just in different areas of our life about how we see a situation and we are tempted many times to, I've got to win this. I've got to figure this out. This is all on me. I'm telling you it's not all on you, and I'm telling myself that as well. Be quiet and be still and know that I am God. That's what God says. Stop thinking you can win this battle. You cannot win this battle. I am the only one that can deliver you. I am the only one that can save you from your mistakes. I am the only one that can rescue you from all the things that you've gotten yourself into, all of the messes that you've created in your life. It will only be because God can rescue. And what did Jacob say? He said, deliver me. And I'm going to tell you, this is what the point is when Jacob said, deliver me, oh my God, God answers with a wrestling match. And he lames him and he says, you're unworthy. You cannot fight against me. I've defeated you. But in your defeat, I'm rescuing you. I'm delivering you. What was the answer to the prayer? That was the answer to the prayer. The answer to Jacob's prayer is, you lose, I win. God says, I win. Notice this here. He says, and Jacob asked, saying, tell me your name. And he said, why is it that you asked me about my name? And he went ahead and blessed him there. The answer to the prayer results in blessing. Not the way Jacob thought it would happen, but it happened the way God said it would happen. It happened on God's terms. It happened God's way. And that's the whole point of this text, is that we got to stop relying on our own strength and saying, I got this, and realize we ain't got this. God's got this. Last thing I want you to see is a new day. Look at verse 30 through 32. Just a few verses. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. And Peniel means, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Penuel, the sun rose on him. What a picture. And he limped on his hip. Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the muscle that shrank, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip and the muscle that shrunk. I want you to see here this picture. There's a change of, not only does Jacob's name change to Israel here, but Jacob recognizes what God has done, and this is a new day. From this point forward, Jacob would be different. Jacob would realize that all of his ways were not adding up to God's ways. They were really ineffective. He was in a desire to fix things and to build his life and to make his life better. All he was doing is creating more trouble. It was a situation, and Jacob would try to fix it. There was no good outcome. I want you to know is that in verse 32 there, he says, therefore to this day the children of Israel do not eat. Israel also remembered. Not only did Jacob realize what happened here, but also Israel remembered. And both of them learned this. They really learned the same lesson, don't they? Is that if you're going to be a recipient of God's blessing, God would say it like this: if you're going to receive my blessing, then you're going to do it my way. I don't know if you're lost, you're not going to come to God your way. You're going to come to God His way. You won't be able to say, well, I'm going to look at my life here and I've been able to do this and I've been able to do that. I'm going to tell you, Jacob had a long list of accomplishments that he was able to do. He was able to figure some things out. He was able to build his life. But all of this was at stake to being destroyed just in one night. And God said, really, I'm the one who holds the answer to your life. And He said, you're going to do it my way. That's what God said. I want to close with this. A question. Do you have a desire for God's blessing on your life? Do you have that tenacity to don't let go? Don't let go. I'm not talking about the kind of blessing that is from good fortune, good luck, material possessions. That's not the kind of blessing that I'm talking about. I'm talking about God's blessing. I'm talking about God really working in your life and blessing you, whether it's that you are realizing that He gave His Son to die for you. That blessing, that promise, because the blessing I'm talking about, it comes down to this. It's the promise that God will preserve. You see, God had promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that He was going to make a great nation. He was going to preserve that family, and He was going to give that family a land. And I'm going to tell you, He's made the same promise to you. If you'll believe in Him and if you'll walk with Him in faith, He's given you heaven as that promised land. He's given you a promise to preserve you in eternal life. And I'm going to tell you, here is what you have to do. Receive that promise. Receive it in faith. Receive it knowing that God can and God will. Not that you can. Not that you're going to be able to figure all this out and make this work. It will be you depending on God, and God's going to figure this out and make it all work. I want to be the first one to tell you that I don't have the answers to every question about what eternity will be like, what happens exactly when you die, and what this and that. I don't have all the answers. All I can do is, like you, trust God and believe Him. That He said He'll save me when I look to His Son. No man can come to the Father except through Jesus. That's all I know. And that's all I'm asking you today, is to put your faith and trust in Him. As we stand, let's have a song of invitation. And let me say this, or let me ask you this. Is He truly the Lord of your life? When you make Him your Lord, you let Him fight for you. When you submit to the Lord, when you say, God, you are my God. You are my God. And I will not let you go. Like Jacob, you have a new identity. You are a child of God. And let me tell you what God does. He leaves His mark on you for the rest of your life, just like He left His mark on Jacob for the rest of his life. It's not some nonchalant thing we just float into and float out of. It's a personal relationship with His Son. As we sing, let's